Welcome back to our channel World of Royals, where we share the latest updates and untold stories about the royal family. Here's a fact that should give anyone pause. Meghan Markle has taken newspapers, publishers, photographers, and media companies to court across borders and jurisdictions. She has pursued legal action over private correspondence, disputed photographs, and headlines she says crossed a line. Litigation has become part of her public defense strategy when narratives move beyond her control. But there is one figure, one investigative journalist, who dissected her rise to global prominence in forensic detail, who published a book called Revenge that assembled patterns many observers had hinted at. And despite all that, she has never sued him. Not directly. Not decisively. Not in a way that would put the claims to a legal test. That journalist is Tom Bower. And the reason his name still provokes tension isn't that he was cruel or sensational. It's that his work was built to withstand scrutiny. Page by page, he documented timelines, corroborated accounts, and testimonies that do not evaporate under cross-examination. That distinction matters, because the real issue was never the book itself. It was what a courtroom confrontation would demand. A lawsuit doesn't just ask whether words were unfair. It opens doors. Emails, calendars, messages, and decisions made behind closed doors become subject to verification rather than interpretation. Public relations stops working. Records take over. So this story isn't about outrage or reputation. It's about why battles are never fought. And once you understand why a case against Tom Bower never materialized, the broader Sussex narrative starts to look very different. Tom Bower did not approach his subject the way celebrity biographies are usually written. He did not rely on heat, gossip, or the fast-moving churn of rumor that dominates entertainment media. He approached it as a matter of record, crafted to withstand challenge rather than applause. What made his work unsettling was not cruelty or tone but structure. Each chapter was assembled as if it might someday be read aloud in a courtroom, stripped of sympathy and tested line by line. Assertions were never allowed to stand alone. They were paired with timelines, corroborated by multiple voices, and reinforced through repetition. This method changes the entire risk profile of a narrative because outrage can be denied, dismissed, or reframed, while patterns must be explained. Bower spoke to people drawn from unrelated worlds, former employees, professional contacts, media figures, and social acquaintances who had never met one another. Many declined to be named not because they disagreed, but because they feared retaliation. The importance was never a single accusation. It was the repetition of the same behavioral sequence appearing across years, contexts, and power structures. Initial charm. Intense engagement during usefulness. Then withdrawal once that usefulness ended. In legal terms, motive is optional. Pattern is not. Bower did not need to explain why events occurred, only that they occurred repeatedly. That distinction separates allegation from documentation. This is why emotional rebuttals never neutralized the book. You cannot disprove a pattern with indignation or carefully curated statements. Patterns require counter-evidence, and none was presented. A lawsuit would have demanded more than denial. It would have required participation. Once filed, control shifts to process, and process exposes what public narratives often conceal. Discovery does not care about intent as later described. It cares about contemporaneous records, emails written during conflict, messages sent before strategies hardened, and calendars fixing people to dates and places. This is where asymmetry becomes decisive. An investigative writer arrives with notes, recordings, and corroboration already organized for scrutiny. A public figure arrives with years of private life never intended for examination. The exposure is not equal. One side risks footnotes. The other risks context, contracts, relationships, and decisions becoming evidence. Even victory would not erase the cost. Depositions create transcripts. Testimony creates records, and records do not disappear. Courts do not seal embarrassment. They formalize it. This reality shapes legal advice. Litigation is recommended only when the issue is narrow, technical, and detached from character. It is avoided when the dispute invites examination of years rather than pages. A case against Bower would not have been narrow. It would have placed behavior, credibility, and consistency under oath. That risk explains why implication replaced action. Hinting at legal options creates hesitation without surrendering control. It discourages smaller critics, reassures supporters, reframes scrutiny, and buys time. Time allows attention to move and pressure to diffuse. But implication weakens when it becomes predictable. When the most exposed critic remains untouched, observers notice. Media logic is unforgiving. If harm was real, why delay response? Silence that once looked strategic begins to look explanatory. This realization spread quietly. Editors adjusted tone. Producers asked harder questions. Commentators stopped softening language. The threat that once constrained discussion lost its force. And once fear fades, questions multiply. By then, the narrative had hardened. Not because it was proven, but because it was never challenged where challenge carries consequence. That absence did not end discussion. It created space for deeper scrutiny and set the stage for the next phase. Once that threshold was crossed, the story no longer depended on new claims. It fed on existing uncertainty, which proved more durable than accusation. Unanswered questions carry momentum. They accumulate weight with each attempt to redirect attention. Over time, the effort to manage perception becomes part of the evidence observers evaluate. This dynamic explains why the book did not fade. It remained relevant not through repetition of claims, but through absence of resolution. Resolution requires exposure. Exposure requires surrender of control. Control was never surrendered. That choice shaped everything that followed. It preserved short-term authority while planting long-term doubt. Doubt does not announce itself loudly. It grows quietly, filling gaps left by silence. By the time its presence is recognized, it has already altered perception. Stories are no longer evaluated on facts alone, but on credibility. This is why the opening silence mattered. It framed everything that followed and determined how future questions would be interpreted. Without a courtroom resolution, ambiguity became permanent. Permanent ambiguity is rarely kind. It does not fade with time. It deepens. And once deepened, it invites speculation that cannot be controlled. This was the condition left unresolved. And unresolved conditions rarely remain contained. They expand. They demand answers. And when answers do not come, stories evolve. This evolution marked the beginning of what followed. It did not end here. It prepared the ground ahead for the next chapter, which came swiftly and publicly, very publicly. Afterward, the silence that followed the book's release did not settle the debate. It transformed it. In the absence of formal challenge, discussion migrated from outrage to inquiry, from defense to examination. People stopped asking whether the narrative was offensive and began asking whether it was accurate. That shift marked a critical change in how the story was processed and why it refused to disappear. Once fear of legal reprisal weakened, previously cautious observers began speaking more openly. Not to accuse, but to question. Questions carry a different kind of power. They do not need proof to exist. They need only gaps, inconsistencies, or unresolved details. And unresolved details began to attract attention precisely because no mechanism was used to close them. Commentators noted that the author himself did not escalate his claims. He did not publish dramatic addendums or issue sensational declarations. Instead, he emphasized restraint. He suggested that his published work represented only what could be responsibly printed at that time. That implication mattered. It suggested process, not provocation, and process invites scrutiny rather than dismissal. The conversation slowly pivoted toward timelines. Dates of travel. Public appearances. Announcements that did not align cleanly with established patterns. Individually, these observations meant little. Collectively, they formed a field of uncertainty that encouraged examination. Uncertainty does not accuse. It invites. Online communities filled the analytical vacuum. They revisited interviews, cross-referenced dates, and compared official statements across years. This activity did not generate verified facts, but it highlighted unanswered questions. Highlighting is often enough. Once something is seen, it cannot be unseen. At the center of this phase was the issue of verification. Verification is final. It ends speculation. When verification is withheld, speculation interprets that absence as meaningful, regardless of intent. This dynamic is unfair, but it is real, and public figures operate within it whether they approve or not. Public responses relied heavily on reframing. Critics were described as malicious. Curiosity was framed as harassment. Institutions were blamed for amplifying doubt. These strategies can consolidate support, but they rarely neutralize skepticism. Skeptical audiences are not persuaded by motive arguments. They want closure. The lack of closure began to take a psychological toll. Observers reported heightened sensitivity to commentary, increased defensiveness, and visible strain in public appearances. These observations are interpretive, not diagnostic, but they align with a common response to prolonged uncertainty. When doubt persists, vigilance increases. Private strain was rumored to mirror public tension. Questions reportedly shifted from external criticism to internal trust. Trust erodes faster than belief. One can believe something and still question it. That questioning, once internalized, changes relationships irreversibly. What made this moment volatile was its intimacy. This was no longer about image management alone. It intersected with identity, family, and truth. Issues that cannot be indefinitely managed through statements or intermediaries. They demand resolution. The rhetorical turning point came from a simple principle repeated calmly and consistently. Innocence welcomes verification. Guilt fears it. The principle is philosophically imperfect, but rhetorically devastating. It reframes the debate from allegation to process, from accusation to refusal. Once framed that way, defenses weaken. Because the question becomes not what is being claimed, but why clarity is resisted. That question lingers even in the absence of evidence. It feeds on silence. As weeks passed without resolution, ambiguity hardened into assumption. Not universally, but sufficiently to matter. Public narratives do not require consensus to persist. They require only momentum. Momentum was sustained by repetition of unanswered questions. Each denial without demonstration reinforced the perception of avoidance. Each attempt to redirect attention confirmed the central issue remained untouched. This stage marked the collapse of narrative control. Control depends on timing and clarity. When neither is supplied, interpretation fills the void. Interpretation is uncontrollable once unleashed. The tragedy of this phase is that it was preventable. Resolution was available. Verification could have ended discussion decisively. The refusal to pursue that option ensured continuation. Over time, the conversation stopped escalating and began settling. Settling does not mean ending. It means stabilizing into assumption. Assumptions are resistant to correction. By the end of this period, the story no longer depended on new claims. It survived on unresolved questions alone. Those questions became embedded in public memory. At that point, silence was no longer neutral. It was narrative. And narratives, once formed, do not dissolve easily. They persist. They evolve. And they wait. Waiting creates anticipation. Anticipation breeds interpretation, and interpretation hardens into belief. Belief does not require evidence once emotion invests in it. That is the danger of prolonged ambiguity. It outlives clarification. It resists correction. And even when answers finally arrive, they are judged through the lens of the silence that preceded them. By then, the story has already written itself in the public imagination, independent of facts, explanations, or intent, sustained by memory rather than proof. Once embedded, these narratives shape reactions, decisions, and reputations long after attention fades and accountability becomes abstract for everyone involved ultimately. The third phase of the story unfolded quietly but decisively, as uncertainty began to replace outrage as the dominant emotional response. Outrage burns fast and fades quickly. Uncertainty lingers. It embeds itself in memory and reshapes how every future detail is interpreted. This shift mattered because reputation and truth operate on different timelines. Reputation can be managed through repetition, framing, and selective silence. Truth resists management. It advances slowly, accumulates incrementally, and often asserts itself long after strategic narratives have hardened. Once verification becomes the central issue, everything else recedes. Motive arguments lose force. Emotional appeals weaken. What remains is a simple unresolved question that refuses distraction. Why was the most direct path to closure never taken? Public figures often misjudge how audiences process ambiguity. Silence is rarely experienced as neutral. It is interpreted, weighted, and compared against available alternatives. When silence persists, it becomes explanatory, regardless of intention. In this phase, commentary turned inward. Instead of debating external critics, observers examined inconsistencies within the narrative itself. Timelines were reread. Statements were compared across platforms. Small deviations, once overlooked, began to matter. None of these discrepancies proved anything on their own. Proof was never the point. The issue was coherence. Coherent stories survive repetition. Incoherent ones generate doubt with every retelling. Doubt functions differently from disbelief. Disbelief rejects. Doubt questions. Questioning invites rumination, and rumination alters perception over time. This is why unresolved questions are so corrosive. They operate silently. As scrutiny intensified, defensive strategies remained consistent. Reframing persisted. Critics were characterized rather than answered. Intentions were debated instead of evidence. These tactics may win short-term loyalty, but they rarely resolve uncertainty. The longer ambiguity endured, the heavier its consequences became. Ambiguity invites interpretation. Interpretation multiplies narratives. Narratives, once established, resist correction even when challenged later. Observers also began questioning the cost of maintaining control. Control requires constant effort. It demands coordination, silence, and vigilance. Over time, that effort becomes visible, and visibility invites suspicion. This stage exposed the paradox at the heart of the strategy. The more tightly the narrative was managed, the more artificial it appeared. Authenticity does not require perfection. It requires consistency. Once credibility is questioned, every subsequent statement is filtered through skepticism. Even truthful explanations struggle to regain footing. Delay poisons defense, because it reframes explanation as reaction. This is why timing mattered so profoundly. Early clarity could have limited speculation. Late clarity, if it ever arrives, competes with months or years of unresolved doubt. The conversation eventually stabilized into assumption rather than debate. Debate implies openness. Assumption implies closure. Once assumptions form, they guide interpretation automatically. This stabilization did not end discussion. It merely changed its texture. The story no longer needed new material. It sustained itself through memory, repetition, and reference. At this point, silence lost any remaining neutrality. Silence became a choice, and choices are judged. The longer the silence endured, the more deliberate it appeared. Public trust rarely collapses suddenly. It erodes gradually, grain by grain. Each unanswered question removes a small amount of confidence until the structure weakens. The cost of this erosion is cumulative. Relationships strain. Narratives fracture. Decisions made earlier under certainty feel unstable when viewed through doubt. At no point did resolution become impossible. It merely became less likely. Each passing moment raised the stakes of clarity, making it harder to deliver without consequence. This is the trap of prolonged ambiguity. It transforms solvable questions into existential ones. What began as a request for confirmation evolves into a test of trust. Once framed that way, resolution threatens more than reputation. It threatens identity. Identity is defended fiercely, even at great cost. This explains why the moment lingered unresolved. Not because answers were unavailable, but because answers had become dangerous. Dangerous answers do not disappear. They wait. They accumulate pressure as time passes. Each new silence increases their eventual impact. This waiting period reshaped the entire narrative environment. Media treatment shifted from caution to analysis. Analysis replaced deference. Once analysis dominates, outcomes change. Analytical narratives persist longer and resist emotional counterarguments. They demand answers. By this stage, The issue was no longer about claims or denials. It was about credibility under pressure. Credibility, once questioned, is difficult to restore. Restoration requires transparency, consistency, and time. Time alone cannot repair damage caused by silence. Silence compounds damage. The longer the silence lasts, the more interpretation fills the gap. Interpretation rarely favors restraint. This reality marked the transition into the next phase, where consequences moved from abstract to personal and from speculation to strain. The unresolved questions remained present, shaping perception and influencing decisions, quietly and persistently. They did not fade. They settled. And in settling, they prepared the ground for consequences that would soon become unavoidable. Those consequences marked the turning point of the story. They were no longer theoretical. They arrived quietly, but they arrived. And once they arrived, nothing remained the same. Everything shifted permanently, without warning or reversal. Possible. By the final phase, the question was no longer why speculation had emerged. The question was why it had never been conclusively addressed. At every earlier stage, there had been opportunities to shut it down. Those opportunities passed, and with each one, the cost of resolution increased. A courtroom would have been the most definitive arena for closure. Courts compel participation. They impose rules. They replace narrative with procedure. If claims were unfounded, litigation could have dismantled them with finality. That option remained conspicuously unused. The reason circles back to exposure. Discovery does not operate selectively. It does not allow partial transparency or curated disclosure. It demands completeness. Completeness is manageable when disputes are narrow. It becomes dangerous when disputes implicate years of decisions, communications, and relationships. A legal challenge would not have focused on one allegation. It would have invited examination of timelines, medical documentation, correspondence, and private deliberations extending far beyond the original claims. That breadth carries risk independent of outcome. Even a successful judgment cannot undo the process that precedes it. Depositions are invasive. Testimony is permanent. Once something is said under oath, it exists beyond intention or context. Courts preserve records. They do not erase them. Advisors understand this calculus. Litigation is a tool, not a reflex. It is deployed when benefits outweigh exposure. When exposure outweighs benefit, implication becomes preferable. Implication preserves flexibility. It signals strength without surrendering control. It allows retreat without concession. It maintains narrative authority while avoiding procedural surrender. But implication decays when overused. When threats are never executed, they lose force. Observers recalibrate. What once deterred scrutiny begins to invite it. This recalibration unfolded gradually. Editors stopped hesitating. Producers stopped softening language. Commentators stopped qualifying references. The absence of legal action against the most consequential critic became its own data point. Timing matters. If harm is real, response is expected when harm occurs. Delay reframes seriousness into performance. Performance invites skepticism. By the time this pattern was widely recognized, leverage had evaporated. The threat of action no longer constrained discussion. It faded into background noise. At that point, the narrative no longer required escalation. It sustained itself through inertia. Stories fueled by unanswered questions persist without intervention. This persistence is not driven by malice. It is driven by human psychology. People seek resolution. When denied, they fill gaps with interpretation. Interpretation does not require evidence. It requires plausibility. Plausibility had been established through silence, inconsistency, and avoidance. The tragedy of this outcome is not reputational damage alone. It is permanence. Once a narrative embeds itself in public memory, it becomes resistant to correction. Even future clarity, if offered, would be filtered through accumulated doubt. Observers would ask why clarity arrived late rather than early. Delay poisons defense. This is the irreversible cost of prolonged ambiguity. It transforms manageable questions into enduring suspicions. By the end, The story was no longer about allegations or denials. It was about the absence of closure. Closure ends stories. Absence sustains them. The most consequential choice was not what was said publicly, but what was never done privately. Verification was available. It was not pursued. That choice preserved short-term control at the expense of long-term certainty. Control feels safer than exposure. Certainty requires risk. In choosing control repeatedly, uncertainty was allowed to grow. Once grown, it could not be recalled. This is why the narrative persists despite fatigue. It endures not because it is constantly refreshed, but because it was never resolved. Unresolved stories do not fade naturally. They resurface during moments of stress, contradiction, or transition. They wait. The final irony is that the very strategy designed to contain scrutiny amplified it. Silence intended to protect privacy became the engine of speculation. At no point did resolution become impossible. It merely became more dangerous with time. Danger delayed is danger multiplied. This is why the story reached its present state. Not through explosion, but through accumulation. Not through proof, but through absence. Not through attack, but through avoidance. In the end, no courtroom was needed to cement the narrative. The lack of one did that work. The unanswered question became the answer. And once that happens, stories stop asking permission to exist. They continue. Long after statements end. Long after attention shifts. Long after those involved hope it will pass. It does not pass. It settles. And in settling, it defines legacy. That is the consequence of silence when clarity is available. That is why this chapter closes without resolution. Because resolution was never chosen. And now, the story stands on that choice. Unchanged, unfinished, and remembered. If nothing was wrong, if every claim was fiction, and if the truth was on her side, why did years pass without the one act that would have ended everything instantly? Why was proof never offered, clarity never chosen, and doubt allowed to harden into record around the public story told by Meghan Markle, while audiences were asked to trust silence over verification?